before doors are kicked, before helicopters flare over rooftops, before Delta Force or SEAL Team 6 move in, someone has already been watching. Long before the War on Terror had a name, the United States realized that elite assault units were only as good as the intelligence guiding them. Precision raids failed not because of poor shooters, but because targets vanished, locations were wrong, or the picture on the ground changed at the last moment. The solution was not more firepower. It was better eyes, better ears, and people who could disappear into the environment completely. That solution became the Intelligence Support Activity, often referred to by its many unofficial names. Task Force Orange, the Activity, or simply ISA. Unlike Delta Force, whose existence has been quietly acknowledged, ISA lives in deeper shadow. There are no public unit patches, no official mission statements, and almost no photographs that can be definitively tied to them. Even within the US military, knowledge of the unit is tightly compartmentalized. Many operators in special operations never interact with ISA directly, only benefiting from the intelligence it produces. ISA was created in the late 1970s in the aftermath of multiple intelligence failures. Terrorist groups were becoming more mobile, more disciplined, and better at hiding among civilian populations. The US needed a unit that could operate outside traditional intelligence channels, something faster than the CIA, more tactical than the NSA, and closer to the battlefield than any conventional intelligence organization. The result was a special mission unit designed not to fight, but to enable fighting. From the beginning, ISA's role was clear: find what no one else can find, confirm what no one else can confirm, and stay invisible while doing it. Their mission was surveillance, target development, and intelligence preparation of the battlefield. They would not be the ones breaching the door, but they would know who was behind it when they slept, who guarded them, and which route they used to escape. Selection for ISO was brutal, but different from assault units. While Delta Force looked for elite shooters and leaders, ISO looked for patience, discipline, and the ability to blend in completely. Operators were drawn from across the special operations community: Army Rangers, Special Forces, Delta Force veterans, and later technical specialists with backgrounds in signals intelligence, cyber operations, and linguistics. What made ISA different was mindset. An ISA operator might spend weeks or months watching a single individual. They learned routines, habits, relationships, and weaknesses. They memorized neighborhoods. They learned how a city breathed at night. They were trained to operate in plain clothes, often unarmed or lightly armed, moving through hostile environments without drawing attention. Where other units trained to dominate a room in seconds, ISA trained to never be noticed at all. By the 1980s and 1990s, ISA was already active across multiple theaters. They supported hostage rescue missions, counterterrorism operations, and intelligence collection efforts in the Middle East, Europe, and beyond. During this period, the unit refined what would later become its signature approach: deep, close target surveillance. This meant living near targets, riding the same buses, eating at the same cafes, using disguises, false identities, and cover stories that could withstand scrutiny. ISA operators were trained not only in surveillance techniques, but in tradecraft traditionally associated with intelligence agencies: dead drops, covert communications, counter-surveillance, and asset handling. But unlike CIA officers, ISA operators were soldiers. They could move with combat units, coordinate directly with commanders, and rapidly shift from intelligence collection to mission support. This made them uniquely valuable to Joint Special Operations Command, which increasingly relied on real-time intelligence to conduct precision strikes. By the time of September 11th, ISA was already positioned to become one of the most important units in the US military. When the War on Terror began, the battlefield changed overnight. Targets were no longer uniformed soldiers. They were couriers, financiers, facilitators, bomb makers, and planners. They lived among civilians, moved constantly, and communicated using basic technology. Finding them required more than satellites or intercepted phone calls. It required humans on the ground. ISA expanded rapidly during this period. embedding itself alongside assault units like Delta Force and Naval Special Warfare's top-tier teams. But unlike those units, ISA rarely conducted direct action themselves. Their job was to make sure others never went in blind. An ISA team might identify a safe house weeks before a raid. They would confirm who entered and exited, what vehicles were used, and which rooms were occupied. They might place tracking devices, map escape routes, or monitor communications. When the raid finally happened, it was often over in minutes, but it was the product of weeks of unseen work. What made ISA truly dangerous to adversaries was its ability to collapse entire networks. One captured phone number led to another, one courier led to a financier, one safe house revealed a bomb-making cell. ISA fed this information into what became known as the kill chain: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate. But ISA dominated the first two steps. Without them, the chain broke. ISA operators also worked in environments where no U.S. military presence officially existed. They operated under diplomatic cover, contractor cover, or no cover at all. In some cases, even conventional commanders were unaware of their presence. This allowed ISA to move freely, but it also meant there would be no backup if something went wrong. They trained accordingly. Operators were taught how to survive detention, how to destroy sensitive material instantly, and how to vanish if compromised. They memorized emergency exfiltration routes. They operated in small teams, often pairs, relying on discipline rather than firepower. Technology became a force multiplier. ISA integrated signals intelligence, cyber exploitation, and biometric collection long before these tools became common across the military. Operators could clone phones on the spot, capture digital data during surveillance, and relay information back to analysts in near real time. But technology never replaced the human element, it enhanced it. Despite their importance, ISA remained almost completely absent from public discussion. There were no movies, no official acknowledgments, and no press briefings. Even within JSOC, their work was often attributed to other units. This anonymity was intentional. The less attention ISA received, the safer its operators were, and the more effective their tradecraft remained. By the mid-2000s, ISA had become the silent engine behind America's most successful counterterrorism operations. When a high-value target was captured or killed, the spotlight fell on the assault force, but behind every success was an intelligence picture built quietly, patiently, and methodically. ISA did not win wars through force. They won them through knowledge. They were not the storm. They were the pressure system that made the storm inevitable. And in the years to come, as raids multiplied and the battlefield expanded, their role would only grow more critical, tracking enemies who never stood still and shaping battles that would never officially bear their name. By the time the United States entered Afghanistan in late 2001, the intelligence support activity was already moving. While assault forces prepared for raids and airfields were still being secured, ISA personnel were quietly deploying under minimal visibility. Their mission was not to engage the enemy directly, but to answer the hardest question of the war: where exactly is the enemy right now? In the early months of the War on Terror, targets were fluid. Al-Qaeda leaders moved constantly, relied on couriers rather than radios, and blended into civilian populations across borders. Traditional intelligence struggled to keep up. Satellite imagery could not identify faces. Signals intelligence often went silent. This created a gap that only close, human-driven intelligence could fill. ISA stepped into that gap. In Afghanistan, ISA teams operated in small elements, often 2 to 4 operators working out of austere compounds or forward intelligence nodes. They conducted close target surveillance on suspected facilitators, couriers, and safe houses. This meant living near targets, watching them for days or weeks at a time, mapping patterns of life down to the hour. When a target prayed, when he traveled, who he met, which vehicle he used, and where he slept. This information fed directly into JSOC strike planning. Units like Delta Force did not launch raids based on single-source intelligence. They relied on the layered picture built by ISA, confirmed visually, cross-checked with signals intercepts, and validated through human movement. ISA operators were often the first Americans to identify emerging Taliban and al-Qaeda leadership structures after 2001. They tracked how fighters crossed borders, how money moved through informal networks, and how leadership adapted when commanders were removed. This was not about one raid, it was about dismantling entire systems. When the war expanded into Iraq in 2003, ISA's role became even more critical. Iraq was not a single insurgency, it was dozens of overlapping networks. Former regime loyalists, foreign fighters, tribal militias, criminal groups, and later al-Qaeda in Iraq all operated simultaneously. Targets changed names, locations, and allegiances constantly. Finding the right person at the right time became the defining challenge of the war. ISA embedded deeply within JSOC task forces operating in Iraq, particularly those focused on high-value targeting. While assault units prepared for night raids, ISA teams were already on the streets, sometimes in civilian clothing, sometimes using Iraqi vehicles, sometimes posing as contractors or aid workers. Their job was to confirm targets beyond doubt. One of ISA's most important contributions in Iraq was persistent surveillance. Unlike drones that could only observe intermittently, ISA teams stayed close. They watched doors. They counted visitors. They tracked vehicles across neighborhoods. In dense urban areas like Baghdad, Mosul, and Ramadi, this human presence made the difference between success and failure. ISA operators also became experts in urban camouflage. They learned how to disappear into traffic, how to sit in plain sight without being noticed, and how to move through hostile areas without triggering suspicion. Many operations involved no weapons at all, only cameras, radios, and discipline. As the insurgency intensified between 2004 and 2007, ISA helped build what became known as the high-value target kill chain. When a raid captured a suspect, ISA personnel were often on site within minutes, exploiting phones, documents, and electronics. They identified contact lists, mapped relationships, and immediately began tracking secondary targets. This speed was crucial. Insurgent networks adapted quickly. If too much time passed, targets vanished. ISA shortened that window dramatically. Information gathered during one raid often led to another the same night. This process reached its peak during the hunt for Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. While airstrikes ultimately killed him, the months-long effort to locate him relied heavily on ISA-driven intelligence. They tracked couriers, identified safe houses, and built the network picture that narrowed his movements to a manageable area. What made ISA unique during this period was not just surveillance, but integration. They worked side by side with analysts, assault planners, aviation units, and interrogation teams. Information flowed in real time. Decisions were made quickly. The result was a level of operational tempo never seen before. In Afghanistan, ISA adapted these methods to a more rural environment. Targets moved through villages, mountains, and border regions where vehicles were scarce and visibility was limited. ISA teams conducted long-duration overwatch, tracked foot movement, and relied heavily on human terrain mapping. They learned which compounds belonged to which families, who controlled which valleys, and how influence flowed through tribal systems. ISA also played a significant role in cross-border intelligence. While official operations were limited by political constraints, ISA monitored movement between Afghanistan and Pakistan, identifying patterns that later shaped broader counterterrorism strategies. Much of this work remains classified, but its impact was felt across the theater. By the late 2000s, ISA had become indispensable. JSOC raids increased in frequency and precision, not because assault forces had changed, but because intelligence had evolved. Targets were no longer guessed, they were known. ISA also began incorporating advanced technical capabilities during this period. Operators carried devices capable of cloning phones on the spot, capturing metadata, and feeding it into larger intelligence systems. But technology never replaced the human element, that a phone number meant nothing without context. ISA provided that context. One of the most dangerous aspects of ISA's work was exposure. Unlike assault units that moved in overwhelming force, ISA teams often operated alone. If compromised, they could not call for immediate support without revealing their presence. This required exceptional discipline and restraint. Operators were trained to abort missions without hesitation. If something felt wrong, a changed routine, an unfamiliar face, a vehicle out of place, the operation stopped. Survival depended on intuition as much as planning. Despite their proximity to violence, ISA operators rarely fired shots. Their success was measured not in enemies killed, but in raids enabled, networks dismantled, and missions prevented. Many of their greatest victories never appeared in headlines because the threat was neutralized before it became visible. By the time U.S. forces began reducing their presence in Iraq, ISA had already shifted focus. They tracked emerging threats, monitored power vacuums, and identified early indicators of what would later become ISIS. Much of this intelligence was gathered quietly, stored, and revisited years later when the battlefield reignited. Through all of this, ISA remained almost entirely unknown to the public. Their work was attributed to others, their failures were hidden, their successes were silent. They were not commandos, they were not spies in the traditional sense. They were something in between soldiers trained to think like intelligence officers operating at the edge of visibility. In the modern era of warfare where information moves faster than bullets, ISA proved one truth again and again. The side that understands the battlefield first controls how the fight unfolds, and as the wars evolved, so would they, moving deeper into the shadows, expanding their methods and shaping operations long before the first rotor ever cut the air. Despite their proximity to violence, ISA operators rarely fired shots. Their success was measured not in enemies killed, but in raids enabled, networks dismantled, and missions prevented. Many of their greatest victories never appeared in headlines because the threat was neutralized before it became visible. By the time U.S. forces began reducing their presence in Iraq, ISA had already shifted focus. They tracked emerging threats, monitored power vacuums, and identified early indicators of what would later become ISIS. Much of this intelligence was gathered quietly, stored, and revisited years later when the battlefield reignited. Through all of this, ISA remained almost entirely unknown to the public. Their work was attributed to others, their failures were hidden, their successes were silent. They were not commandos, they were not spies in the traditional sense. They were something in between soldiers trained to think like intelligence officers operating at the edge of visibility. In the modern era of warfare where information moves faster than bullets, ISA proved one truth again and again. The side that understands the battlefield first controls how the fight unfolds, and as the wars evolved, so would they, moving deeper into the shadows, expanding their methods and shaping operations long before the first rotor ever cut the air. ISA operators on the ground carried compact exploitation kits that allowed them to copy phones, laptops, and storage devices in minutes. In some operations, the goal was not to capture or kill a target, but simply to access their digital footprint without alerting them. Teams would enter a location while a suspect was away, extract data, and leave no sign they had ever been there. The target continued operating, unaware they were already mapped. As Syria descended into civil war after 2011, IS's role expanded again. The chaos created new transit routes, new militant factions, and new opportunities for global jihadist movements. ISA monitored the flow of fighters across borders, tracked facilitators moving between Iraq and Syria, and identified early signs of consolidation among extremist groups. By the time ISIS emerged as a major force in 2013 and 2014, ISA had already been watching many of the individuals who would become its leadership. Former al-Qaeda in Iraq members, financiers, and logisticians had never disappeared. They had simply gone quiet. ISA's long-term data allowed analysts to reconnect old dots quickly once ISIS began operating openly. During the campaign against ISIS, ISA once again became a key enabler of JSOC operations. As Delta Force and other assault units conducted high-risk raids in Iraq and Syria, ISO provided the targeting backbone. They identified meeting locations, tracked senior leaders as they moved between safe houses, and verified targets before helicopters ever launched. Unlike earlier wars, ISIS operated heavily online. Propaganda, recruitment, command and control, and funding all flowed through digital channels. ISA adapted by blending physical surveillance with cyber intelligence. An online account could be traced to a phone could be tied to a person could be watched, followed, and eventually intercepted. ISA teams worked closely with partner forces such as Kurdish counter-terror units and select Iraqi elements, but maintained strict compartmentalization. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis. Even friendly units often had no idea how a target had been identified, only that the intelligence was solid. Some of the most sensitive ISA-supported missions during this period involved hostage recovery planning. While assault units trained for the physical rescue, ISA tracked hostage movement, identified guard rotations, and monitored communication between captors. In several cases, hostages were moved too frequently for a raid to be viable, but the intelligence gathered shaped later operations and airstrikes against the same networks. By the late 2000s, ISA's mission had expanded beyond counterterrorism. As great power competition returned, the unit refocused on state-backed actors, proxy forces, and hybrid threats. This required a different mindset. Targets were more disciplined, more technically capable, and often protected by layers of plausible deniability. ISA adapted by emphasizing signature reduction. Operators blended deeper into civilian environments, used non-military equipment, and operated under cover identities for extended periods. Some missions lasted weeks without direct contact, focused entirely on observation and pattern analysis. The unit also refined its coordination with cyber and space-based intelligence assets. Surveillance was no longer limited to physical proximity. Digital exhaust travel records, financial activity, online behavior became just as valuable as visual confirmation. IS's strength was not any single tool, but its ability to fuse all of them into a coherent picture. Despite advances in technology, the human element remained central. Machines could flag anomalies, but only trained operators could interpret behavior. A delayed meeting, a changed route, a new intermediary. These details mattered, and ISA operators were trained to notice them. In modern operations, ISA often works months ahead of kinetic action. By the time a raid occurs, the target's habits are known in detail. Entry points are chosen based on routine. Timing is selected to minimize risk. Even escape routes are mapped before the first breach. Many ISA-supported operations never result in raids at all. Some targets are neutralized through arrest by partner forces. Others are disrupted financially or isolated from their networks. In some cases, simply knowing they are being watched causes a target to shut down operations entirely. The unit's secrecy remains absolute. ISA personnel do not seek recognition. Their work is attributed to others or remains unacknowledged. Even within the military, few understand the full scope of what they do. This isolation is deliberate. The less attention they attract, the more effective they remain. Today, ISA operates across multiple regions simultaneously, tracking threats that may not surface for years. They build files, maintain databases, and preserve institutional memory that outlast any single conflict. When a new crisis emerges, they already know the names. They are present before wars begin and remain after they end. They operate in silence, without insignia, without announcements, and without public victories. Their success is measured by what never happens: attacks prevented, leaders never met, networks dismantled before they mature. In an era where warfare is increasingly defined by information, the intelligence support activity represents a quiet truth of modern conflict. Battles are often decided long before the shooting starts. And in that unseen phase of war, ISA is already there, watching, tracking, and waiting.